Pasture and rangeland researchers, as well as nutritionists and ecologists, typically consider foraging only in terms of how the physical and chemical characteristics of plants influence an animal's ability to achieve high rates of nutrient intake. The social environment, if it's considered at all, is seen as a nuisance variable. This is an unfortunate oversight. A young animal's interactions with mother and peers have a lifelong influence on where it goes and what it eats. As psychologist Paul Rosen points out for humans, suppose one wishes to know as much as possible about the foods another person likes and eats, and can ask only one question. What should that question be? There is no doubt about it. The question should be, what is your culture or ethnic group? There is no other single question that would even approach the informativeness of the answer to this question.
Mother and peers really play an important role, especially in social creatures. They become the transgenerational memory for the species. By going with mom and doing what she does, young animals learn what and what not to eat. They also learn where and where not to go. And they really learn about every part of the environment as a result of interacting with mother. As they age, they start to interact with peers, and that becomes another big influence in terms of food and habitat selection. We teach a short course each year for Natural Resource Conservation Service. Field studies that we have people do has to do with mother-young interactions. And it's just amazing to watch how much influence mother has on what those lambs do. Basically, they go with mom and they do what she does. Then later on in the whole ordeal, we just expose the lambs alone to the foods. And it's fun to watch them. Go for the food that mom's been eating, avoid the food she's been avoiding. And then we'll typically mix lambs that come from mothers with different preferences. And there'll be some jostling around, but they'll usually end up going with the food that their mom's been eating and avoiding the one that their mom avoids. There were some studies done with goats several years ago, and they had these mature adults that came from 4 different islands. They put them all on a common island, and this common island had all the foods that occurred on the original islands that they came from. So it was a smorgasbord of all those foods. Well, what did the adults do? The adults stuck with their dietary habits, and so it had, even though all these goats were mixed socially, they were all eating what they'd eaten on the islands they'd come from. The question is, what did their offspring do? And the diets of those offspring over the next 4 years became an amalgam of what they'd learned from mother and grandmother and so forth by that point in time, but also of their interactions with peers. And so their dietary habits were becoming more similar with generations. We've done experiments in Idaho where we took offspring from mothers who lived in 2 different parts of an environment, cross-fostered them, and then looked at their fidelity to site. And basically what you see is they go where their foster mother went and do what she did in that environment. And that makes sense. It's simply reflecting the fact that that's what they've been born and reared around, that's what they're familiar with, that's the habitat that they come to occupy. The same sort of thing, this high fidelity to site, has been shown in a number of wildlife species. Geese, with their preferences for environments and habitats. Mule deer, bighorn sheep, moose, all. So very high fidelity to site. And again, the reason is that there's advantages, incredible advantages in knowing a location, a particular place. There's a very interesting example of moose in Norway who behave totally differently from the norm in that country. Most of the moose migrate from higher elevations down to the seashores in the winter. But there's a population of moose that are known to migrate uphill rather than downhill. What they found was through archaeological evidence that humans had started to pit trap this particular population of moose. And evidently, originally, they had migrated from higher elevations down to the seashore, but the pit trapping caused them to change their behavior. And that's now been maintained, evidently, for about 5,000 years, and the way that's maintained is simply culturally. The offspring learn from their mothers where to go seasonally, and this particular group migrates uphill rather than downhill. Where do habits come from? You know, these experiences early in life change creatures neurologically, morphologically, and physiologically. Perhaps the easiest way to think about this has to do with muscles. We're all born with muscles, but how those muscles develop, the amount of strength and stamina that muscles have, totally influenced by how those muscles are used. If you can, by analogy, think about the central nervous system, the neurons, the patterns of firing, the connections that are made, the morphology, how that animal is built inside, the physiology, how it functions, all those sort of things are being influenced by experience. So we say it's hard to change habits. Well, when you're changing habits, you're basically changing the structure of the system, neurologically, morphologically, and physiologically. We've reared goats, for instance, from 1 to 4 months of age on the shrub blackbrush, which is very poor nutritional quality. And then we've looked at their rumen size compared to goats that were reared on more of a concentrate ration. And what we find is the goats that are reared on blackbrush have enormous rumen compared to the goats that were reared on the concentrate ration. It makes sense though. In order to meet energy needs, if the concentration of energy in the food is very low, it takes a very large vat to ferment a lot of food in to try to reach total energy requirements. And so the volume of the rumen is changing as a function of the quality of the diet. And we know that for all of these internal organs, they're changing as a function of use. And always it's use it or lose it. From the genetic standpoint, one would argue that the body determines the structure of experience. If you think about what we're talking about here, though, you realize that experience at the same time is influencing the structure of the bodies. Again, the beauty from the management standpoint is simply that we can change things very rapidly within the lifetime of the individual if we understand that creatures aren't set in stone. They've learned how to behave as young creatures, and we can influence that by influencing the environment that young creatures are reared in. We can also influence that if we need to in adults by changing the environment to change their behavior.
Managers negate the effectiveness of social learning when they move animals to unfamiliar environments. In a new environment, animals must learn through trial and error about foods, water, cover, and predators. This reduces efficiency and increases risks. Animals in a new environment spend as much as 25% more time foraging, but ingest 40% less food than animals reared in the environment. This results in greatly diminished reproductive rates and lower weaning weights. Little wonder ranchers often describe cases when livestock were introduced into an unfamiliar environment as the year from hell.
Yeah, that 4-year period was, I don't have a doctor's degree, but that was, it was like getting a doctorate in grazing management. It was time well spent. I don't think I could have learned as much in, graduate school as what I did in that. Working with those and seeing so many different operations and being out there with them and actually helping the landowners make some of those management decisions, but then also kind of having to be responsible for some of the decisions we did make. And especially having the dairy farms in there was a real learning process because you got such an immediate response to some of your grazing management decisions. Whereas with the cow-calf operations, we would try to periodic way, but it may be every 3 months or maybe monthly, and it was a while from the time you made some decisions on what you thought about forage quality and how fast they needed to be moving. It was a while before you got any feedback. With the dairy cattle, what we did today showed up in the milk tank tomorrow. And those dairy farmers were not bashful. If we made some mistakes and milk production dropped, they weren't bashful to call me that night and say, hey, we got to do something, get back out here. Basically, we started with Holstein cows that, yeah, they had been out on pasture, but pasture had been used mainly as an exercise lot, and all they were taking in was being hauled to them. Silage, concentrates, TMR type rations, and a lot of those Holstein cows didn't know they could put their head down and graze off the ground. And it was a learning experience for us as well as the cows, making the adjustment from total mixed ration over to the forage out there on the ground being a large component of their feed.
The dairy industry in New York is the #1 agricultural industry in the state. So we have some 700,000 lactating dairy cows in the herd, and that generates a lot of economic activity throughout the state. So the pasturing that we're looking at and talking about is a way to lower the cost of production and make a more profitable standard of living for a lot of folks in the state. Well, historically it was a pasture-based system, but over the years they've gone to the confinement where they put the cow in the barn and bring the feed, all of the feed to the animal and feed it in known quantities and known amounts, but doing it in the barn under very controlled conditions, and that's very expensive. So now we're trying to go back to using pasture, but using it much more effectively than we have been in the past 30 or 40 years. And a lot of times when these cows go out to pasture for the first time, it's kind of a frightening experience for everybody. I mean, the first thing is the farmer wonders if the cow's going to stay on the place, making sure that the fence is strong enough or it's charged enough with electricity to do that job. But the cow itself goes out and rumbles around the pasture and then looks for the barn, wondering whether or not they even belong outside. In a lot of cases, they're born and raised in the barn or on concrete, and going out to fresh grass and trying to harvest their own feed is scary for the cow, it's scary for the farmer, and it's scary for the agribusiness or the agency person that's trying to help the farmer get started with this. When they first go out on pasture, they don't recognize pasture as a source of feed, and if they've been making a lot of milk in the barn and they go out on pasture and they don't eat, milk production takes an immediate big drop. So in order to get that production back, the farmer says, well, I better start feeding back in the barn again, and that just is counterproductive to teaching them that pasture is a source of feed. There's been a fair number of tense moments. People call with the strangest questions at different times of the day about why aren't my cows eating, or what's happening to milk production, or what's wrong with this whole system. And it's just, these cows just don't understand that pasture is a source of feed, and it takes some time to educate them. But in the long run, once they finally get through that hurdle and recognize that pasture is a high quality feed and the animal becomes accustomed to harvesting it themselves, then they can really start seeing the benefits of having been out there. Trying to get these animals to be more effective at grazing, it's like a lot of things. Starting early in life and getting some help while you're out there learning how is kind of critical. So these younger animals, the heifers, as they're being raised, having them raised on grass, being familiar with grazing, certainly helps them be better grazers when they go out on pasture in the milking herd.
For a dairy cow reared in confinement, the barn is habitat. Ingredients from a total mixed ration are food, and water comes in a trough. On the other hand, for beef cows reared on rangelands in the western U.S., riparian areas and uplands are habitat. Grasses, forbs, and shrubs are food, and water comes in streams and ponds. When these animals are moved to feedlots, total mixed rations aren't food, and feedlot pens aren't habitat. As surprising as it may seem, similar behavioral challenges occur when people change grazing management practices, even within the same location.
I went out to the marsh for the first time, and I realized what a very unique ecosystem it was. When you have to wear boots that start at your knees and boots that go to your hips and then boots that go to your chest, and you have to learn how to drive a boat just to go out and check your cattle, and then it's very different from where I was raised and where I worked. So it's quite unique.
When you bring upland cattle from what we call upland is anywhere other than the marsh. It can be 10 miles sometime, it can be 40 miles. But when you bring upland cattle down into the marsh environment, there are some problems that occur. These upland animals are not accustomed to going out into the water and into these really mucky soils. They sink sometimes a foot deep, and then there's half a foot of water on top of that to harvest the forage. And these animals that are raised in these upland dry situations, they have trouble adapting to the marsh sometimes. Years ago, when the marshes were grazed, it was kind of an open range, and to some extent it's still that way. You have 3 or 4 or 5 family members or non-relatives that run the cattle together in big herds. And traditionally, for example, in the Hackberry Grand Chenier area, there were some large tracts of marshland, and they would turn out sometimes 1,000, 1,500 head of cattle, say October during the year. And these cattle distributed themselves pretty well throughout the marsh areas. And they grouped up in small groups, you know, maybe 20 or 50 head of cattle. And a lot of that had to do with where the cattle came from. If they were my cattle, maybe they stayed in a group because they were accustomed to being together. And if they were my cousin's cattle, they stayed together in the group and so on. And they kind of each went along, dispersed themselves throughout the marsh. And you ended up with bunches of cattle in different places in that marsh. And these cattle had their calves there during the spring. And then they were taken to the uplands during the summer. And then when the heifer was old enough to be put into production, she was put with the herd out with the bull, and she returned to the same spot and had her calf, and the cycle went on and on and on. And now we're coming along and trying to improve the grazing conditions and the habitat conditions by going to some controlled grazing systems where we go to a 2-pasture, a 3-pasture, a 4-pasture type situation in these same grazed marsh areas. And some of the things that are challenges to us as managers in trying to get these systems put into place has been that these cattle that have been raised down here in these certain areas in certain groups for generation after generation. And one of the problems is when we do put up a fence, construct a unit, and we attempt to move the animals into a grazing area, and we intend for them to stay in that area, they have adequate nutrition, they have clean water, they have everything that's needed, they still attempt to get back to these sites where they were born, where they were raised, and it's an ongoing struggle to keep the animals in the unit that we intend them to be in.
We got them to put the animals into one herd and rotate the animals through different units as one herd. And what I found that completely different from what I thought would happen was that once the animals were put in one herd and they grazed an area and were going to be moved to another location where the grass was going to be greener and more palatable, that they all would be very anxious to go. And what I found that happened was that the animals, once you moved them, they would actually jump into the canals, swim the canals to go back to the location they had always grazed at. So once we put the fence up, where the animals could not swim the canals, I received a phone call from the wildlife biologist and said, you need to come down here and see this. And what I found was there was about 20 animals that stood at the fence and just bellowed the entire time and refused to eat, refused to move from the fence unless they were in the location they were used to. They were raised in that spot. That's how they know to graze. They're not familiar with an area, and if they're not familiar with it, they won't put their head down and start grazing like most cows. They'll walk up and down the ridges until something looks familiar to them.
We normally ignore the role of culture in food and habitat selection. In doing so, we increase the amount of effort required to manage grazing. Ironically, if we allowed social organization to evolve, we might have more efficient grazing without fences, which would be better for land, animals, and people. Bison families are the foundation of an enterprise owned by Bob Jackson and Sharon McGee. Within extended families, young bison learn to use the territory where they are born and reared, which enhances their welfare and that of the environment. Bob and Sharon's appreciation of culture comes from lifelong observations of wildlife, especially bison, while working for the National Park Service in Yellowstone National Park.
I've been in the backcountry of Yellowstone all the time since 1972. And as a backcountry ranger, you do a lot of poacher boundary patrol, which means that you have to know the wildlife back there. I had the interest in the wildlife, and with that, then of course you have the observations of what's happening back there. You start watching, your bison, your elk, your moose, your deer, your sheep. It's all important as far as catching poachers and doing your job. So then you start thinking how to apply this to your own life, because I still had the rural background. And I always wanted to be, in that kind of a situation, so I never went permanent with the Park Service. I always do half a year in Iowa and half a year in Yellowstone. And we went to bison because I saw them there in Yellowstone. They could pretty much take care of themselves, and so the two jobs fit together well.
I was working in the backcountry at the north end of the park in the Lamar Valley and out of Tower, and enjoyed a lot of that, but I really didn't get to live in the backcountry. I would go into a backcountry cabin for, say, just overnight a couple times, that type of thing. And the Lake District decided, because I was a hard worker, they'd like to steal me away from the north end of the park. And so they gave me a trip, or sort of a vacation, to come down to Thoroughfare where Bob was stationed. And pretty much that's how we met. And at that time, he was talking about the buffalo, and the buffalo that he had raised for years, and I was always fascinated in that type of thing. Buffalo is something that I'd never had much experience with other than observing them in Yellowstone. I'd observed elk and deer a great deal more. So this became sort of a fascinating thing possibly to try doing, and that's how I happened to come to Iowa and buy my 320 acres, which is part of our operation.
We started out with just the two little calves and one bull, and now we're up to about 1,000 acres, and we got around 300 animals. We doubled the land mass. It's really helped out with the infrastructure of these herds, because now these animals can separate out into their own family identity groups.
I'm able to see something natural in an agricultural setting, that you can really observe the cows and their calves and the daughters, the previous daughters, the yearlings from the year before, and all of them working as a social structure. One time where we were out on a tractor and observed a cow and her yearling, and I believe there was a 2-year-old, but her calf at the time was lame and it had fallen behind. The cow, for whatever reason, needed to keep moving, and she was going ahead and grazing. And so one of her daughters stayed behind with this calf and just sort of brought it along, and that was a family unit that was sort of helping each other out, which of course had to be terribly important with survival. These weren't individuals trying to survive. This was, a group working together.
You can see how these animals graze, and they graze a lot different than if you're weaning calves off, if you're sorting them out where they're not with the mothers, where they don't have the chance to assume roles. And so these animals graze a lot closer together in these family groups. They support each other, they depend on each other. And so maybe, what you see is where they're not trying to eat the best all the time, but it's more important to stay within that group. When they have a dominant family group, maybe they will displace another group from further away, because the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence. And so then you might have the rotational grazing, because these animals are always moving around as separate groups and displacing other groups. To us, efficient grazing is just a byproduct of strong infrastructure. When you take that away, you put stresses in on them. And so our animals in our herds have never had a single shot. They don't have the diseases because the stresses aren't there. They gain better when you put them into new locations, because they have the securities amongst themselves.
It's such a new concept, it's such a new idea. I mean, it's totally foreign, certainly to the way that we raise cattle, and a lot of the bison producers, of course, were cattle producers. And so it's very different for them to think in this particular mode. If the family group thing does catch on, which I certainly hope it does, that it will be the ecological way to go, and that it will be proven eventually that it is so much better for the land, that there are so many gains rather than losses by doing it this way.
In livestock, extended families form when calves, lambs, and kids aren't weaned. Within the framework of the extended family, young herbivores learn the skills they need to survive. Curiously, we often move animals to unfamiliar environments without concern for their family or where they were raised, and then wonder why they don't perform well. The more we understand how animals learn, the more we appreciate how social interactions, extended families, and culture help animals adapt to local environments, and how that may actually benefit landscapes.